Hi folks, Steve here, back with another video. Today I'm painting the Night Herald from Meridian Miniatures. So this is one of two Night Herald miniatures, and they came as part of a recent Kickstarter from Meridian Miniatures. And the sculpts are by Andrew May and they're based on artwork by Black Crab, and I'll place links for their Instagrams down in the description if you want to have a look at them. Now the first thing I want to mention is that this is not a sponsored video, so I've not been paid or incentivized or asked by Meridian in any way to do this. I just backed the Kickstarter and got the minis as normal, and I just like them so much that I decided I wanted to do this just because of that. And at this point I've already assembled and based the mini. It was a simple enough process. They're resin miniatures, and the hands with the weapons and the head were separate, so I just gave them a quick file and stuck them down with some super glue. And the base is just some bits and pieces that I had lying around cobbled together. To get this set up for painting, I'm going to give it a zenithal prime, just because that's kind of my go-to. It's what I enjoy doing. So quick spray black with this is Vallejo polyurethane primer, and then I'll do a top-down spray with some white paint, thinned down nicely so it goes through the airbrush. Doesn't matter what white paint it is, or I don't think it is anyway. Some people like to use white ink, things like that, but I'm quite happy with just whatever white I have to hand. I just make sure that it's thin enough to go through the airbrush easy, and so it's not going to come out with any spotting or speckling on it. The important thing to do with the white is to make sure that it's focused mainly on top down, or at most a kind of 45-degree angle, so you're allowing the white paint to pick out the detail and the upward facing higher edges, and so it creates that nice bit of contrast where you have the white and then the black underneath in the shadows, and it's really useful for getting to see all the detail and the layout of the mini before you start painting. And it also helps us with the painting process anyway, because we have lighter areas naturally where the highlights are going to be, and the darker recesses already have black in, which is going to help us reinforce the shadows. And here we are, ready to begin painting. You can see there that I've just quickly filled in the base of the mini there. All I did was just painted it with a cheap craft burnt umber paint, just to block the colour in. It just makes things a little bit easier later on. So I'm going to start with the tunic, the sort of the large item of clothing that takes up the majority of the mini. And this is going to be red overall. You can see the colours in the top right hand corner that I'm going to be using as I move along. So I'm starting off with these two colours, which are Vallejo model colours, violet and red leather. Obviously if you don't have these colours you don't have to, they're not it's not vital that it has to be those shades, I should say, those specific colours. You use what you have, it doesn't have to be exactly what I have. So basically a purple and a kind of dull red, almost a brown really. But so we're going to start doing the purple first, and I'm just going to do one section at a time. So at the moment I'm doing the lower bit, as you can see, and the violet's quite watered down. It's on a wet palette there, so it's got quite a bit of moisture in, and I want this to not dry before I move on to the next colour, to the red leather, which is why I'm just focusing on one bit at a time. So you'll see soon when I've got the violet blocked in, I'll switch to the red leather, and I'm just going to start stippling that onto the mini over the violet, and it's just going to allow it to blend naturally, because both the paints are still wet as they're coming into contact with each other. And so I'm not using very broad brush strokes to get this on. I'm sort of stippling and dabbing with the end of my paintbrush, occasionally moving it along a bit where there's ridges and creases and whatnot. Focusing, you'll be able to see it a bit better there. So you can see how wet it is at the moment. It's still very shiny. The purple hasn't dried at all, and so I'm dabbing on this red leather. And what we're going to be doing really, we're building up a base of colour. So the violet is going to remain mostly in the deep shadows and recesses, and we'll get a fairly decent coat of this red over the top of that, but it's going to blend quite subtly, and I'll go over each area a couple of times to build it up. So it will start quite a bit darker, and it will build up gradually, and I'll focus more on areas that I would assume are going to catch higher light. So you can see there where it's a little bit more vivid, the red that I'm putting on that area on the back there, because that's an area that I think would catch light if the light was coming down from a roughly upwards direction. I've not completely made my mind up on the direction of the light at the moment. When I began painting him, I think I ended up with a sort of to the top left coming down, or well, it would be to his top right, but if we were looking at it, it would be the top left. And you can see there, so I'm just pushing the brush in, so it's that kind of stippling effect. I'm not being too careful with it at the moment because this is a very early stage, so it's really just a case of building up colour, and it looks terrible, it looks really messy, but this is one of the cases where you really have to trust with the process. So we're going to be going over it with a number of colours a number of times, and it will gradually build up and look much more presentable. And the idea here is I'm going to go around each area, so once I've done this lower area, then I'll move on to the chest and the sleeves, because they're all part of the same item of clothing, and so I'll be doing them all in the same way. And so you can see here now I've gone over all the area that's going to be this red fabric, and so everything has had the base of violet, and then the red leather worked in on top through that kind of stippling, so you can see the violet is still there underneath, but we've got a pretty decent coat of the red. So now I'm going to move on to a slightly more intense, more vibrant red, so this is blood red from Coat d'Arms. Again, it doesn't matter exactly what red you have, but we want something that jumps up in its intensity. And so I've just mixed a little bit of the red leather in as well, just to tone it down slightly so it's not too big a jump. And we're going to start doing the same process as what we did with the red leather. We're stippling it on, we're making these little dots and marks, so it's quite a sort of random selection of patterns, but we're going to start focusing in a little bit now. So we want this to be on the areas that are going to be more intense in colour, more vibrant, so places that are going to catch the light more. So as you can see, I'm starting on his left sleeve, and I'm focusing more on the top of the sleeve, the shoulder, and then the bit where it flares out as well. And so any of the raised edges and the folds in the fabric, the little bits of detail, things like that, that's what we want to start picking up now. And we're generally going to work our way around the model again as we did with the initial red leather, and we're just going to start building that more intense colour, putting the red where we think that the light's going to be striking it, just to build that up as we go. And you can see the brush I'm using, it's not a very small brush, it's quite big. I think it's a Games Workshop size 1, something like that, but it's quite an old brush. As you can see, the tip on it is really gone, but it's very useful for this kind of work. Nice shot on my fingers there, but yeah, because the bristles are quite splayed out, it naturally helps us get that stippled effect as we're moving along. So it's giving us that textured look, and the more layers of stippling we do when we paint fabric like this, the better the effect, because excuse me, the layer of texture builds up, and the translucency of each layer of paint on top helps blend it all together nicely, and so you just get this rich sort of mottled effect where the colours build on top of each other. So once we're happy with this level of colour, then that's when we'll move up to the next stage. So I'm just going to work around. Now I'm going to start working in the next colour in my gradient here, and so this is Elf Flesh from Army Painter. The reason I'm going for this rather than like a white, for example, is don't want the red to go too pink, if that makes sense. So adding a flesh colour, adding something that's not a pure white, is going to avoid it becoming too pinkish. It's going to help keep that the kind of red element to it, but we're going to get a much higher volume without it looking sort of pale and pink or even sort of desaturated. And so what I'm doing now is we're repeating the same kind of process, and I'm focusing on tighter and tighter areas each time. Still doing the random kind of stippling and dabbing motion, really focusing on what are going to be the areas that will catch the most light. So we're effectively trying to get our highlights in now, really. So these are going to be your upper raised edges and everything that's kind of facing upwards, and just looking at where the folds of the clothing fall and what's going to pick that light out the most and what I want to stand out. Same goes for the sort of parallel folds across the back. I want to try and pick some of them out more and make them stand out, and just generally boost the impact of what's going to be the light that's shining on the mini in our imaginary world that we're painting here. So I'll continue doing this. I'll do multiple passes as well, so just to make sure I'm happy, keep doing it. The more you build it up, the more effective it's going to look as well. So all these little random markings that we're making will all come together to give a much more pleasing effect on the eye when we're looking at the mini when it's finished. And here you can see just the overall effect that I've achieved so far with this stage. That's just about done for this colour, and you can see that's really, if I get it in focus so you can have a look, so that's really boosted the colour there. So we've got the purple undertone, the red, and it's starting to get some really nice highlights going on there. It's looking quite nice. And so we're getting towards the final stage of the of this red material for now. And so what I'm adding onto my palette now is the final colour, which is Army Painter Necrotic Flesh. And this is actually it's pretty much a white, but with a bit of green in it, so it's a very greenish off-white. And I'm adding that into the mix from the step before, which was the Elven Flesh and the red. And this is just to give it a final boost, and it works a little bit better than just adding more of the Elven Flesh, because it adds just a little bit more of a pale colour to it, so it really stands out a lot more, rather than simply adding more of the same colour from the previous step. And so I'm going to use this, swap to a smaller brush now. This is, I believe this is a Games Workshop Artificer brush, but like anything like a small, like a size 0, something with a good point on it is fine for this. And as you can see, I'm going to pick out some of the actual details, so like the edges of the like the damage to the cloth, the folds as well. Again, I'm doing very light touches and drawing on some little scratches and lines now as well, so we're adding a bit of additional painted texture. So there's still some of the stippling, but also I'm drawing some lines across as well, so drawing them parallel across the material. And this is going to, again, we're adding more texture, more detail, and it's going to give it the impression of it being some time-worn, battered cloth, basically. The paint I'm using is also very thin, so I've just been added a little bit of the fresh paint into the original mix, and just a little bit more water as well. So it's not quite what I would call a glaze. It's still thicker than a glaze, but it is really quite thin. So once it goes on, and then you'll see as it dries, it goes very light. And this means that I can go over an area multiple times. And again, when you're drawing these little marks and lines on, having layers of them. So you're making several marks over an area. Once it's dry, going back, making several more, and you just get this layer of effect, like the texture that you would get in worn and old cloth, hopefully, anyway. And so I'm picking out the edges of the material as well, so where you might, traditionally doing edge highlight anyway, the ridges on the cloth. Probably doesn't show up very much on the camera at the moment because of how thin it is, but you can really see the effect when you see the miniature in person. Once it's dried and you've got the multiple layers on, it builds up and it looks really nice. At this stage, this is just a case of working around the mini section at a time. Again, thinking about where we've been putting these placements for where the higher concentration of light is going to be. And it's always best to focus just a little bit more on those areas. We don't want to over highlight the darker areas, but there's certainly nothing wrong with if you do get some of these marks and scratches, all across the surface, then it just helps carry that illusion of the fabric all the way along. So it's really not the end of the world if your brush goes into one of the those deeper recesses, and you can see where I'm sort of scoring across there, and it is touching on some of the folds where you've got the deeper violet colour inside it, and that's not a problem at all, because it just helps continue the look of the fabric across the entirety of that surface. Once I've done with this bottom area here, then it'll just be a case of making my way all across the miniature, picking out all the edges, and continuing to focus on creating these lines of texture and little dots and marks in various spaces, just to break that surface up and give it a more natural feel. And once I'm happy with the effect I've achieved with that, then I'll go around again, do a final check, a final pass, just using this colour to make sure that I'm adjusting the highlights on the folds and the outer edges, so continuing to apply mainly just in little dots and little taps of the brush here and there rather than long strokes, so it's nice and textured, to keep that texture that we've been building, just to make sure that I've adjusted all the areas and that I'm happy overall with the way that the light is catching them. And with that step completed, we're then finished with this red section of the cloth for now, and so we're able to start moving on and working on other parts of the miniature. Oh, and before I forget, we'll quickly cover how I did the inside of the slashes on his sleeves. So for this I was sticking with the small brush, and I used a base coat of Vallejo Game Colour Leather Brown, which is incredibly similar to the Games Workshop colour Snakebite Leather, or whatever its variant or namesake is these days. So again, had that on my wet palette, so it was nice and thin, not too thick straight out the bottle, and just going to give all them a coat with the Snakebite Leather, and then move on to highlight it. To highlight, the next colour I'm going to use is a Citadel colour. It's Xandru Dust, which is basically a yellow ochre colour. We'll just go into exactly the same areas as before within these folds, but we're going to focus it in on a slightly smaller area, so I'm not going to take it quite as high up the slash, and focus it more on the outer edges where the light will catch. Then once we've done that step and followed that throughout all the slashes on both sides of the sleeve where they're visible, we'll then move on to Screaming Skull. So this is just a regular bone colour, and we're going to mix a little bit of that into the Xandru Dust that we already had, and then use that to complete a final highlight of the inner bits of those sleeves. Okay, so we're now going to start on the skull of the Mini, and this process will apply the same to the rest of the bones as well, but I'll just concentrate on showing you on the face. So we've already got the Zenithal Prime has already given us a sketch of the highlights and the shadows, but what I'm going to do is really bring that down by painting in the shadows with a quite dark brown. So this is a mix of Vallejo wood grain and just a matte black, and I'm going to make sure that I get all the major recesses with that dark colour just to really reinforce it, and then I'm also going to go over pretty much all the rest of the bone as well, primarily focusing on the mix that's got more brown in than black, just to knock back the white of the zenithal. So we're going to put some more layers of lighter colours on as we work through, but I want to make sure that we've got a nice dark base to work from. And the zenithal is going to do a bit of work for us as well, because that's going to make sure that the brown that I'm layering on top of that is still going to look quite light compared to the shadows. So that the sketch that we did originally, that's going to help us out at this stage. Once I've done this, we'll then start moving on to the lighter colours to build up the highlights. And so at this stage, what I'm doing is switching over to a Screaming Skull, which is a Citadel bone colour. It's a very light bone colour. And going back to the stippling brush that I used earlier, I've got this bone colour quite thin on my palette, and we're just catching the high edges, the raised edges, things like that, and we're making lots of little marks that are adding some detail on. And I'll just get focusing on there so you can see better. And so you can see the difference there. So where we'd gone over with the dark brown, and that still left us quite a bit of information in terms of the light placement from the zenithal. We're going around and reinforcing that using the stippling technique here, and it's just going to build up a really nice mottled sort of aged bone texture. And I'm just going to work around the skull. You can see that I've filled in the other areas of bone, like the hands and even the weapon as well, with the same dark brown that I had before. So we'll use pretty much the same kind of techniques on them as well. So I'm going to continue going here, and the focus and the emphasis of these marks is always going to be on the upper area. So if I go down and do any of the lower bit like the jaw, I'll then go back up and adjust the upper area to make sure that that's going to be the area that's catching the most light, that has the higher volume to it. And we're going to use a few glazes of a few different coloured paints a bit later on to just add a bit more colour to it. I want to introduce some greens and things like that to give it an aged look, and this will also help tone down that effect. As you can see, it looks very, very bright at the moment, and we do want it to look a little bit more grimy, a little bit darker, and so we will go and do that. But at the moment, I'm really just focusing on getting the kind of textures and the light placement that I want across this skull. And this exact same process I'll continue with the hands and the legs, any other sort of bone areas that I would paint. And so here what you can see is I'm actually finishing off the highlights for the top part of the skull. And so I'm just using this, the same paint as before, the Screaming Skull. However, it's not diluted, or not diluted as much. It's on my wet palette, so it's not completely as thick as it would be out of the pot, but it's a lot less dilute. With the small brush, I'm just picking out some very fine sort of edges and details just to make sure that it pops. And so this is going to be a lot more opaque than the thinned down version that we were using for stippling that added texture on, so it is going to stand out more. But if you find it doesn't, you can always incorporate just a small amount of white into it as well, which will really help give it a boost. So if you try it first with the Screaming Skull as it is, or whatever the bone colour is that you're using, and if you're not happy with it, just boost it a little bit. Just don't take it too white, because you don't want to actually wash out that bony look that we're developing. You don't want it to go too white. Okay, so now I'm going to start glazing. So to do that, I'm going to take a little bit of Goblin Green and mix this into the dark brown that I had originally. I'm going to add a bit more water. We want to thin this down so it's essentially a glaze that we're using at the moment. And just do like that, test it on the back of your hand. You should see that it's going into the sort of the recesses of the creases of my skin. That's exactly what we want here. So I'm just going to go on. It's nice and thin. We're going to focus on the sort of the recessed areas and draw it out slightly. So the idea is this green is going to be some kind of moss, mould, whatever you want to call it, something that's started growing in the recesses of this old bony thing. And so we're going to pop that in and then just draw it out onto the rest of the bone. and it is a very thin colour, so it'll dry a lot less saturated than when you put it on, and you can go in for multiple passes if you want to build it up, and it's just going to add a bit of variation, a bit of visual interest to what is otherwise essentially an area that's got really just one major colour to it and shadow. So I'm just going to go around and give the same treatment to the rest of the bone on the mini and the hands and whatnot, so it'll be in between the hands and the knuckles, things like that, and just build that up so we get a nice mouldy looking bone colour to it. And once I'm happy with that, I'm going to go back to my small brush and back to our lightest bone colour, and I'm just going to take this opportunity just to pick out the teeth, just any final bits of raised areas that I just want to accentuate again. Like I said, mainly just make sure that the teeth are looking nice and bright pearly whites, just so they stand out there. And now it's time to start on the remaining cloth, and so this is going to be painted yellow, or it's going to look yellow when we're finished. And so I'm going to start off by base coating this in leather brown. It's a Vallejo model colour. Like I mentioned earlier, it's very similar to Games Workshop's Snakebite leather, but any kind of leather colour like that will do as a good start for this. And so I'm just going to give it a couple of thin coats just to build a nice base layer on that. And once I've done that, I'll now move up to Zandri Dust. You can see here, so the last coat of the leather brown is still wet on there at the moment, so we're going to take advantage of just a little bit of wet blending. So I'm just lightly adding the Zandri Dust on, using the same brush that I was using earlier, so it's quite a thick brush. It doesn't have a very nice point to it, and most of the motions I'm doing, you can see there's some sweeping motions there, and there's also a little bit of similar to the stippling motion we were doing earlier, so just building up a nice bit of texture as we're adding this colour onto it. And it's just a case of working around this colour, trying to get this on whilst the leather brown underneath is still wet, just so it helps us with that blending. And we'll just sort of focus on tighter and tighter areas as we start picking out the edges and the folds and things like that. And moving into the next step, so I've added a brighter yellow into the Zandri Dust to create a little mix there. I can't remember the exact name of the colour, but you can see the pot behind me, behind my hand there, so that gives you an idea of the type of yellow that I'm going for. So again, we're just using this kind of pine dabbing motion, getting this texture on, getting the colour on, focusing again on the edges, on the raised folds, things like that. So we're just going to build it up step by step, very similar or exactly the same kind of process as what we did on the red cloth earlier, and so we're just going to follow that along with the yellow and let that build up nicely. And finally, for the scarf, I'm going to incorporate some of our old friend Screaming Skull into our final Zandri Dust and yellow mix, and use this for the absolute highlights here for the final bits. And so I'm going to want to catch the edges and the very upmost parts of the raised folds and things like that, and I'll continue to use the same kind of dabbing and stippling random motion on the upper parts. For the edges here, that's fine to just run the brush along and catch them like you would an edge highlight, but we just want to work this in now and just create those final touches of highlights that are really going to make this part of the cloth on him stand out. And here, just to show you the progress that we've made so far, so it's all coming together quite nicely. You can see I've carried over the same technique onto the straps on his legs for the yellow cloth, and the bone as well on his legs and his hands, and we've coloured in the various pouches and things with a basic brown too. So we're now going to move on to the oil wash stage of the mini, so we're getting quite close to the end now. Prior to this, I just finished off a few of the details, so the bags and pouches, they got a quick highlight using some of the leather brown and a little bit of bone, and there's a few additional straps which I just painted a basic blue colour, and then highlighted by adding a little bit of the Screaming Skull bone to that. So those are just some couple little quick bits that didn't think was worth including in the time, as this video is already stretching out to be quite long. And so I'm just getting set up for the oil washes at the moment. I've got a little bit of black and a little bit of burnt umber onto my palette, and you can see I use this exclusively for oil paints, which is why it's absolutely manky. And I'm just going to dilute those with a little bit of white spirit from the pipette dropper there. And you can see I always have a well that has some plain white spirit in the top one there of the three, and that's just for helping to clean my brush and just in case I need to dilute something a little bit more. And so I'm just going to get these mixed to a nice wash consistency. If you haven't used oils before, they can seem quite intimidating at first, but they're actually relatively simple to use. You just need to remember to make sure that everything else on your mini is completely dry. So I've not varnished this or coated it in any way. This is just the acrylic paint, but it's all fully cured, fully dried. I often use a hair dryer just to give it a quick go over, just to make sure that everything is dry and locked in place, and then you shouldn't have any issues. Excuse me. So you can see I'm just applying the wash here. You don't need to be gentle or very careful with an oil wash. We want to get a nice healthy coat all over it, and then we'll, as it begins to dry, that's when we'll start removing the oil wash, and so we'll take it off from the higher areas. So in case you haven't used it before, the main aim of using oil wash is to apply what we would call a reductive process. So we add the wash onto the mini, and we allow it to begin to cure, to start to dry a little bit, and then we're going to start removing some of it. It takes a very long time to dry, which gives us lots of time to work with it. And so you can see that I started on the burnt umber towards the top, and then I've dipped my brush into the black as well, and started working that in the lower areas. So it's going to gradually, the colour of the wash is going to darken as we go down, and then I'll actually use pretty much the pure black, whatever's left of that, on the base as well, because I always oil wash the base of the minis as well, just to make sure that it all ties in and it comes across as being part of its environment. Okay, so you can see I'd completed the oil wash and I've left it for a while to begin to dry. It's probably had half an hour, something like that. How quickly it cures will depend on a number of things. So it could be what you use to dilute your oil. So I use white spirit or mineral spirit, and that does evaporate quite quickly. So when your oil wash is quite thin, then that means it will dry quite quick. But you can see on the mini that there's some areas where it's still quite wet, but that doesn't really matter because we're removing the wash from the upper surfaces anyway, so that doesn't make too much of a difference. And still having a bit of moisture to it means that it actually assists us with blending. You don't want it to be fully cured, or else then it becomes very difficult to remove. And what I'm doing here is just taking this is just a small sponge. It's actually a makeup sponge, or supposed to be a makeup sponge, but I like to use these for removing oils, as I find them very effective. Some people like to use cotton buds and things like that, but my preferred method is a makeup sponge. And so you can see I'm just moving around and just wiping away. It's a bit like I suppose like a reverse dry brush. So you're doing the same kind of strokes as you would with a dry brush. So you're going to start at the upper points of the model and move your way down, and you're wanting to catch the raised surfaces, the bits that stick out, those details, because then you're going to be removing the majority of the oil from there, and so that will expose the colour more underneath, and so that those bits will be brighter. And you can see that I've gone in with this is another kind of makeup sponge, some kind of applicator, and this just gives me a little bit more control when I'm going in between certain, like difficult to reach bits of the mini, things like that, and it just allows me to direct where I'm removing the oil more. And this stage is really just about removing the oil until you're happy with it. So you want to try and keep as much in the recesses, in the areas that are going to be dark and shadowed, as possible, and then remove it from the upper layers where you want the light exposed, and so you'll be able to see the underlying colour much more easier. And once you're happy with this stage, then the best thing to do is to just put your mini aside and just give it plenty of time for that oil to fully cure. Normally it's best to give it at least 24 hours just to make sure that everything in there is completely set and dried. At that point you are more or less complete with the mini. Sometimes there are a few finishing touches you can do. I like to re-highlight any metallics just to make sure that they have a nice shine to them, as the oil paints can give a bit of a matte finish once they're completely dry. You can even go in again and retouch up some of the highlights as well. I like to do that now and again, just to really make those pop. You don't need to do them to the extent that you did before, but just pick out a few details here and there, and that can just really make the difference, and it's a nice touch to do. Other than that, the only thing to do now is to just complete the base, and then that is the mini finished, and so we'll have a look at that now. And so here we are, one finished Night Herald. Apologise for the length of the video, thanks for sticking with me, hope you enjoyed it. That's all for now, and so I'll see you next time. Thanks very much, bye for now.